Evacuation orders in place for the Kimberley with record-breaking floods causing widespread damage. An urgent plea from authorities after another father drowns while rescuing their child.
We're just imploring people, if you're coming down to the coastline, you're on holidays, make sure you find a spot where you see our lifesavers.
A party divided, Republicans failed to elect a new Speaker in the US House of Representatives.
Edge taken, big scream from the opening bowler. Job done for South Africa.
And an early blow for Australia in the pink test. David Warner is dismissed for 10. Hello and welcome to ABC News. I'm Dan Borscher, coming to you from the lands of the Gadigal people. Record flooding is causing havoc across Western Australia's West Kimberley region, with the Fitzroy River expected to peak later today. Authorities expect the town of Fitzroy Crossing to remain cut off for at least a week, with hopes clearer skies will allow helicopters in to rescue stranded residents and to drop off supplies. Dylan Storer is a freelance journalist who grew up in Fitzroy Crossing and joins me now from just outside the town. Welcome to the program. What are the conditions like there?
Well, the conditions at the moment are a bit clearer than they were for the past few days here in Fitzroy Crossing, although the wind is just starting to pick up again now. It's a bit drier today than what it has been, but at the moment I'm standing here in Junjur, and behind me is one of the major roads that connected parts of the Fitzroy Valley. This road runs to a cattle station, it runs to a national park, it runs to multiple Aboriginal communities, and is currently cut off at the moment. To the left of me, the main road, to the rest of the town's cut off, and to the right, the main road out to another Aboriginal community is also cut off. Fitzroy Crossing at the moment, to paint a bit of a picture, is basically like an island, completely surrounded by floodplains and completely cut off from the rest of the country, except via boat or via air. Again, we're waiting with bated breath. Hopefully, the river will not come up too much further. It's expected maybe another half a metre max is what they're expecting. But there is the potential for that to come up a little bit more as well. So basically, the feeling in town at the moment is just waiting and seeing and making, hopefully, it won't come up too much more. We might see the peak of it today, and it may start to come down, but it's just a case of waiting with bated breath down.
And we can certainly hear that wind there, Dylan, and apologies to our viewers. We will persevere, though. How are locals reacting there?
I think it's a state of shock, to be honest. The river comes up every year. There is always a wet season. But again, this has completely smashed existing records, or pre-existing records. The last record flood was in 2002, where it was just over 13 metres high. This is now over 15.5 metres high. So this is up 2 metres above what anyone else has ever seen before. I, like most other people here in town, I believe, probably we're expecting it to be a similar flood to what we get on most years. But what we've seen is really shocking to a lot of people. Our shops are underwater. There are multiple houses underwater. There are, community buildings, government offices, churches, playgrounds, all underwater in the town centre at the moment. And I think a good way to paint a picture is Fitzroy Crossing was built for floods. We moved decades ago to higher ground to avoid floods. And a lot of the remote Aboriginal communities that are affected by floods, they also built their homes on stilts and on mounds to get away from them. But even Fitzroy Crossing town houses and buildings are going under. And even in some of those remote Aboriginal communities where the houses were built on stilts, those homes are also being inundated. This is something that is completely unprecedented for the Kimberley region. Our main bridge is also sustained structural damage. That could be months away. This is going to have lasting repercussions for the economy, for the local social and emotional well-being as well, for many, many months to come.
Yeah, it gives a sense of the volume of water. How is this situation impacting pastoralists, cattle and other wildlife?
Yeah, I was out on the boat yesterday and the day before, and you see many dozens of kangaroos, many dozens of lizards and other animals floating in the water. I've heard people have seen pigs floating by. and trying to swim and get out of the floodwaters onto dry land. But what's probably the most shocking images that we've seen is of these cattle floating down the river, supposedly what seems to be washed away from the pastures that they're on. These large cattle stations, large parts of the pastures are actually floodplains. And again, the levels that we're seeing is not something that's been experienced here before, which means that for a lot of pastoralists, they probably weren't expecting it to come up that high and that fast. It did come up really fast in comparison to a lot of other things that we've seen. And yeah, we've seen the images of those cattle being washed down the river. Some have been caught on the bridge, which is very close, and have managed to get up out of water. Some others are being rescued. Same for the kangaroos. People are attempting to rescue what they can, but it is just too much for the community to handle at the moment in order to rescue all of those animals, unfortunately. But very, very shocking images, particularly of those cows floating down the river.
Just finally, Dylan, I mentioned at the start that we're expecting for that Fitzroy River to peak later today. What are you expecting there on the ground, and have conversations started to turn yet to assistance and recovery?
I think we're still in the assistance phase at the moment. I know the Australian Defence Force has been activated, is on the way to assist with some evacuations. I think a big issue at the moment is that the main town evacuation centre is nearing capacity, and it may still be a few days until the waters recede into homes. People may still need to stay there while homes are refurbished, for example, and will need alternative accommodation. So the Defence Force is going to be shuttling people and potentially flying them to Broome to get out of Fitzroy Crossing for the time being, while their homes are inundated with water and during that first stage of recovery. But I think there will be a reflection that occurs after this flood. Again, the bridge will need repairing. Large sections of the highway will waiting to see how much will need to be spent. That will be millions itself just to fix the highway and connect that important economic and social link through the region. But we've also got the issues with the town centre being underwater for the first time. We've got issues like climate change, for example. This region is expecting more and more torrential rainfall as the decades go on in the forecast and in the climate modelling. This is going to be something that occurs more regularly in the future. So there will have to be discussions and planning about how we can better protect this town against flooding in the future, to protect homes, but also to protect, the healthcare outcomes, the social outcomes, and also the local economy as well. It is going to be a bit of reflection and a big time coming. I know there are a lot of conversations going on at the moment about the initial response, what could be improved, and how we can make the coming months better. I think it's a case of waiting and seeing for the time being, but hopefully we can all get through this, and Fitzroy Crossing will be a better town on the other side.
Yeah, certainly many considerations after this immediate emergency. Dylan, thank you for your time. Dylan Storer there, a freelance journalist at Fitzroy Crossing. A 42-year-old man is drowned trying to save his daughter from a rip on New South Wales's mid-north coast yesterday afternoon. It comes 3 days after an off-duty police officer drowned trying to save his son on the south coast, and it's the 6th drowning at the state's beaches this summer. Reporter Madeline Cross joins me now from Port Macquarie. Maddie, a horror start to the season.
That's right. So the 42-year-old Sydney father drowned yesterday while trying to rescue his own daughter from a rip here on the mid-north coast. Now, New South Wales Ambulance and Emergency Services were called to Back Beach at just north of Foster yesterday afternoon. Now, witnesses say the man entered the water at the beach when he noticed his teenage daughter getting stuck in a rip, and that's when he ran into trouble himself. Now, thanks to a nearby surfer who came to the assistance of the pair, the young teenage girl was brought back into shore safely. However, when the surfer returned back out to the water to assist the father, he was unfortunately found unresponsive and was unable to be saved. Police say the father was on holidays from Sydney when this occurred on the mid-north coast. Officers are conducting inquiries and a report will be prepared for the coroner. But it's in a horrific week, as earlier this week Another father on the far south coast of New South Wales drowned while trying to save his own teenage son. That was on New Year's Day, and that was 44-year-old off-duty police officer Peter Stone. And as well, further north of here on the far north coast of New South Wales, a 27-year-old man unfortunately drowned at New Brighton Beach this week as well.
Maddie, what's the message that you're hearing from lifesavers?
Yeah, well, authorities and surf lifesavers are really urging people on holidays and beachgoers to make sure they attend patrolled beaches, as well as know what to look out for and how to spot a rip, as well as how to get out of a rip. Now, this is what New South Wales Surf Life Savings Steve Pearce had to say earlier.
Again, it just comes down to people, and we understand this, are trying to find spots that aren't as crowded. But the issue is, if you're trying to find a spot that's uncrowded, essentially it's unpatrolled. And if you don't see any red and yellow flags there, any lifesavers or lifeguards on duty, well, essentially we just can't see you to save you. And again, we're just imploring people, if you're coming down to the coastline, you're on holidays, make sure you find a spot where you see our lifesavers, because we've seen so many tragic drownings already this summer.
That was Steve Pearce there, urging people to attend patrolled beaches this summer, especially if they're on holidays. We've also spoken to local surf lifesavers here in northern New South Wales who say there have been many near drownings as well on the coast, as well as people becoming injured in the rough surf that we're seeing, especially on the northern parts of our coast. So really urging people to be aware of the conditions, but most importantly, go to a beach where there are lifeguards.
Madeline Cross reporting from Port Macquarie. Water levels in the swollen River Murray are now said to be reaching levels higher than those recorded back in the flood emergency of 1931. But it's hoped a joint disaster package from the state and federal governments will ease the pain for affected residents and businesses. Patrick Martin reports from Waikerie in the state's Riverland.
The state government says the $126 million support package is the single biggest disaster relief support scheme in the state's history. Jointly funded with the Commonwealth, nearly half of the money will go towards removing hazardous waste from properties once the water subsides. Businesses damaged by floodwaters will get up to $50,000 each, while primary producers can get up to $75,000 apiece to help rebuild fences and levees. $10 million will be tipped into the assessment of properties for electrical reconnection, and $800,000 will go toward managing fish kills from blackwater events. But this flood event is far from over. The peak isn't expected to reach here in Waikerie for another 3 to 4 days, with levels expected to at least match those seen in 1931.
Concerns are being raised over the use of e-scooters after 3 riders in 2 states ended up in hospital after crashing into cars. It comes as Melbourne extends an e-scooter trial across several council areas. Isabella Tolhurst reports from Melbourne.
2 teenagers sustained several traumatic injuries when the e-scooter that they were riding down a hill collided with a car last night. The girl and the boy were believed to be riding on the same scooter in the Sunshine Coast when it collided with a car. They were both airlifted separately to hospital in a critical condition. It comes as a 48-year-old man suffered serious injuries in another scooter collision in Sydney. It's understood that he was riding his scooter alongside a taxi on Bay Street in Brighton Le Sands when the taxi performed a U-turn and collided with the scooter. It's unclear whether the man was wearing a helmet at the time, but it's believed to be quite a high-speed collision given the amount of damage that is done to the car. Emergency services arrived on scene and worked on him for quite some time before transporting him to hospital. There was also a passenger in the taxi who was seen to for minor injuries as well. Now, all of this comes as Victoria has just renewed its trial of e-scooters in 3 different council areas in the inner city. The trial has been extended for 2 months so that the government can see whether or not they want to legalise both rental and privately owned e-scooters. At the moment, e-scooters that are privately owned are illegal in Victoria, while you can still buy them. They're not legal to ride. The question of whether or not the trial is going well is probably different according to who you ask. Victoria Victoria Police over the past year have issued 827 infringements, many of those being for failure to wear a helmet and for riding on a footpath. They've also recorded 252 collisions. We're hearing from hospitals and emergency departments that they've seen a major increase in people presenting with injuries caused by e-scooter accidents. That is, of course, because there are more people riding, but it does bring up the question of whether these are a safe mode of transport. However, majority of people are doing the right thing and using these scooters in the appropriate manner. Many people here in Melbourne love them for their convenience, they're cheap, they're good for the environment and they're fun. So the jury is still out on whether they will be continued going forward.
More wreaths and flowers are being laid for the 4 victims of Monday's mid-air helicopter collision on the Gold Coast. Investigations are continuing into the accident, which left 3 others in hospital. Reporter Heidi Sheehan is following developments from the Gold Coast and joins me now. Heidi, Queenslanders are leaving many floral tributes there.
The collection of floral tributes here at Southport on the Gold Coast has been growing throughout the day. The local council here has set up a designated spot where people can come and pay tribute to those who lost their lives in Monday's mid-air collision. The location is just across the water, across from SeaWorld and the site of the crash itself. The 4 people killed are being remembered. Ashley Jenkinson, he was SeaWorld's chief helicopter pilot. He was killed that day. He is being remembered by friends as a good bloke with a generous heart, and he leaves behind a partner and a young child. Ron and Diane Hughes were also killed. The husband and wife, aged 57 and 65 years old, were visiting Australia from the UK. And Western Sydney woman, Vanessa Tadros, has also died. Back home, her friends and neighbours and family are still coming to terms with her death. Here's a bit about what one of her neighbours had to say when he heard the tragic news.
Vanessa was just a wonderful person, very loving. Very selfless person. Yeah, she's just happy to give and always smiling, very loving mother and very loving wife.
Vanessa's son, who was also on board that day, is recovering in hospital, along with Winnie De Silva, a woman from Geelong. She's in hospital, as well as her 9-year-old son, Leon.
Heidi, do we know anything more about the investigations?
Well, that investigation by the Australian Transport Safety Bureau is now well underway, and we're unlikely to hear the results of what exactly caused that collision and what they've found for some time, a matter of weeks, if not months. There are many things that officers will be taking into account, from eyewitness accounts for anyone who may have seen it from here or the theme park, a vision from on board and from on the ground. They'll also be reviewing things like SeaWorld's procedures and policies, as well as the frequency at which the SeaWorld helicopters were coming and going from that landing pad.
Heidi Sheehan reporting from the Gold Coast. Ukraine says at least 3 people have been killed in another day of strikes on the country's east, while Russian authorities insist its rockets hit military targets. Meanwhile, in Russia, mourners have held vigils after a rare government admission that dozens of troops died in a Ukrainian strike.
One by one, Russians pay tribute to those killed in one of the deadliest days of Putin's war so far. They've been told 63 soldiers died in a Ukrainian strike on Russian-occupied Makivka. Kiev says the death toll is actually in the hundreds.
We gathered because it's hard for everyone. When it's hard, we should be together.
Russian nationalists have questioned why so many conscripts were placed in a building together and alongside an ammunition depot. In overnight strikes, an ice rink in Donetsk became a theatre of war. A nearby train station and church were also damaged in the attack.
The centre of town was hit and 20 residential buildings have been destroyed.
Russia claims it was targeting a military storage site and that it destroyed hundreds of rockets provided by the West. Ukraine's allies have promised to send more weapons.
First of all, we are determined to keep on answering the Russian aggression of Ukraine as winter sets in. Ukrainians need our support now, more than ever.
Ukraine has named the first Russian commanders it wants to bring before a war crimes court. There are around 50,000 crimes under investigation. Each day, as more horrors are exposed, that number climbs. Michelle Rimmer, ABC News.
Republicans in the United States have failed to unite and elect a new Speaker of the House of Representatives. The House has now been adjourned and will meet again tomorrow to try and break the stalemate. North America correspondent Barbara Miller has been following developments in Washington.
In 3 rounds of voting, Kevin McCarthy, the Republican frontrunner, failed to secure a majority. Now, that's because he's facing a rebellion from hardline members of the party. They've been pressing him ahead of today to make concessions. Those concessions go to budgetary measures, go to border policy, go to the way the whole House is run and the ability of members, for example, to put a vote of no confidence in the Speaker. They weren't happy. They signalled that, and 19 of them on the first couple of votes and 20 on the third vote did not back Kevin McCarthy. They backed Jim Jordan of Ohio. Now, he, at the moment, has no real chance of becoming Speaker, but what they're doing is signalling a protest against Kevin McCarthy. Now, what this means is that we're looking at a very divided Republican Party as it takes back control of the House following the midterm elections, and it's also a sign of just how much power these members on the fringes, more on the fringe or on the edges of the party have, because they have a very slim majority in the House, and that of course means that people on the fringes tend to have more power because they can extract better deals to ensure there's a unified party. Now, the Speaker's position is a very important position. Nancy Pelosi is the outgoing Democrat from that position. After the President, in the terms of line of succession, it's the Vice President and then the Speaker. And they're also the person that sets the legislative agenda, the investigative agenda. And we know Republicans want to look into several aspects of the Biden administration and the dealings, business dealings of President Biden's son, Hunter Biden. So no decision reached today. The House did agree on one thing, and that was that after 3 rounds of voting, taking about over 5 hours in total, they'd had enough. They'll come back again tomorrow, but you can be sure as the night goes on here on Capitol Hill that behind closed doors, there's a lot of wheeling and dealing going on as people try and work out how to get past this deadlock within the party, the Republican Party, on what really should have been a day of celebration for them.
Thousands of people have lined the streets to say their final farewells to soccer legend Pele, who'll be buried in a cemetery in Santos after a private ceremony.
As the wake drew to a close, the last few people raced to see Pele's coffin and say their final goodbyes.
Pelé was a huge soccer player. Here in Brazil, we love soccer, but he was also a huge human being. He supported a hospital in our city called Hospital Pequeno Príncipe. He donated a lot of money to research, and that's why we are here today.
It's the Brazilian most known person around the world. Pelé is money, How many times I got in places in the United States and stuff just because I was Brazilian, just because people knew Pelé.
Teofilo was the first in line yesterday, and he was queuing again to say another goodbye.
Pelé united us all. He was humble. As well as being the best player in the world, he was a marvellous human being.
And then one high-profile visitor sped through the gates. Lula da Silva's first presidential event since taking power at the weekend. Greeted with cheers and boos, the country's united in mourning, but deeply divided by politics. When it comes to Pelé, he's the only man who everyone here loves. And then the party began. What better way than samba to celebrate this Brazilian legend?
This is a day of mourning, but it's also one of celebration. nation too, wanting to send off their king of football, and they're doing it in style.
Pele's coffin paraded through the city of Santos on board the fire engine. Passing by his mother's house, she turned 100 last year. And what a journey that was ahead of the private burial. It's here where Pele will be laid to rest, not a block of flats, a necropolis fit for a king. With an enviable view over his old football stadium, his final wishes honoured.
Finance now, and here's Sue Lannon. Sue, so what's the latest with the collapse of crypto exchange FTX?
Yes, well, we saw the founder, Sam Bankman-Fried, plead not guilty to criminal charges overnight in the US. So that involves fraud, money laundering and also conspiracy. So he's accused by US authorities of cheating investors and stealing customer deposits from the cryptocurrency trading platform. He's accused, for instance, of illegally diverting customer money to buy real estate, make political donations and do risky trades at his cryptocurrency hedge fund Alameda Research. So he's entered his plea to 8 criminal charges in a New York court after he was extradited from the Bahamas last month. So this trial will go on for at least this year. Now, he's denied criminal activity, just admitted failings and putting them down to mistakes. But the bad thing for Sam Bankman-Fried is that 2 of his closest associates have pleaded guilty to similar charges, and they're cooperating with prosecutors. So it is a very serious situation. US authorities have described this case as one of the biggest financial frauds in American history.
Yesterday you were telling us about cost of living pressures continuing to increase. Today, home insurance costs are continuing to go up as well.
Yeah, no surprise there. We've been watching the terrible footage of the floods around the country, and millions of customers are seeing their home and particularly contents insurance going up. So that's according to a survey by the comparison website Finder. They're saying 2/3 of people they surveyed of home and contents customers say their premiums have gone up in the past 12 months, although 1 in 5 said they saw no change. So Finder says people should really shop around because new customers get the best deals. However, the Actuaries Institute, they're like forensic accountants, they say some Australian homes could be uninsurable. I mean, we've heard those anecdotal reports of people being asked to pay more than $10,000 for insurance, particularly those in flood-prone areas, and businesses being charged more than $30,000 a year. The median cost of an annual home insurance premium is around $1,500 a year, according to the Actuaries Institute. But people in more vulnerable areas, such as Northern Queensland, the Northern Territory, Northern New South Wales, face much higher premiums because of natural disasters. Now, the Actuaries Institute saying they face more than 4 weeks of annual household income paying per year in their premiums. So that's more than $2,000 a year.
Wow. And going up and up. What about the markets? What can you tell us about how they're looking today?
Yeah, well, they are going up today. They've recouped most of yesterday's losses, and nearly all sectors are higher on the Australian market. So let's have a look at how the market's doing. The All Ordinaries and the ASX 200 fell 1.3% yesterday. Today, they're up about 1.2%. And as I mentioned, nearly all industry sectors are gaining. That's aside from energy stocks after a drop in the price of oil overnight. Now, among the gainers are industrial firms, miners and banks. Let's have a look at the movers. Now, these are the top movers in the ASX 200. The lithium firm Sayona Mining is doing the best. Also going up is battery materials maker Novonix, and ANZ's jumped today, up about 3%. Going down, oil and gas firms, as I mentioned, Woodside Energy and Viva Energy, and gold miners are driving the market as well today. Now let's have a look at Asian markets. The Nikkei is lower in today's trade. Now, factory activity dropped sharply in the latest figures. Going up today is New Zealand market after returning from a public holiday yesterday. Let's check out Wall Street. It started the new year with a dip as electric vehicle maker Tesla and IT giant Apple lost ground. So we saw Tesla fall 12% as it delivered fewer cars than predicted over the December quarter. Now, it's also being fined by South Korea's fair trade regulator for not telling customers about the shorter driving range of its vehicles in low temperatures. Apple's market value fell below $2 trillion for the first time since March 2021, and the major indices all lost ground. Let's turn now to commodities. As I mentioned, oil prices slumped overnight and gold prices have hit a 6-month high. Oil prices fell because of the higher greenback. There's also concern about demand in China after weak manufacturing figures from there over the past few days. And the Australian dollar also took a hit overnight as the greenback rose. It actually fell more than 1% overnight, but higher now over lunchtime, buying around 67.5 US cents. And investors are awaiting the latest minutes from the US Central Bank, which will give a hint as to whether they'll have more steep interest rate rises. And they're out tomorrow, Dan.
Thanks, Sue. And you can keep up to date at news.abc.net.au and on ABC iView. Here are the top stories on ABC News. Major aerial supply efforts are continuing in WA's Kimberley region due to record flooding inundating communities and swamping key roads. Ex-tropical cyclone Ellie is slowly moving towards Broome, dumping hundreds of millimetres of rain into already swollen creeks and rivers. Some communities are expected to be isolated for at least a week. New South Wales authorities are pleading for water users to take care after a spate of recent drownings. Already 6 people have lost their lives this summer, including a 42-year-old man who died while trying to rescue his daughter from a rip on the mid-north coast yesterday. Republican leader Kevin McCarthy has failed to secure the role of US House Speaker after 3 rounds of voting. Mr McCarthy is the leading candidate but is struggling to win the support of a small group on the right of his party. Voting has been adjourned until tomorrow. It's the first time in 100 years that a Speaker has not been elected in the opening round of voting. And in the cricket, Matt Renshaw has tested positive for COVID-19 after being recalled to the test team for the first time since 2018. The confirmation of his positive test came after Australia won the toss and opted to bat in the 3rd test at the SCG. Proteas bowler Enrique Nokia was removed opener David Warner for 10. There have been 6 drownings in New South Wales this summer, with 2 people dying just this week after trying to save their children from a rip. A survey by Surf Lifesaving has found more than half of those who thought they could spot a rip got it wrong. Here are some of the things to look out for. This video from Surf Lifesaving shows that when water is brought into shore, the waves break over the more shallow sandbanks. The easiest way for the water to flow back out to sea is through the nearest gutter, creating a rip current. These can often appear as the darker, deep patches of water. Researchers have been using dye experiments to visualise the process and get the message across.
If you know what to look for, you're looking for these narrow, dark gaps, these deep channels. They might be 5, 10, 15 meters wide. It's almost like a green path going out through the whitewater. And you put the dye in, and I mean, rips are there to take all the water that's coming in with the breaking waves back offshore. So they're almost like a river of the ocean. And they, even on small days, when the waves are quite small, they flow fast. And I think, you know, one of the reasons it's been a bad period is we've had fantastic weather. The waves haven't been that bad. People are flocking to the beach. And often those rip currents, the dark gaps, look like inviting water. I mean, a lot of people don't like breaking waves, so they pick what looks like the calmest place to swim. And quite often, not always, but quite often that's the rip current.
Rips are so hard to read because they can be different sizes, shift locations and flow in different ways. They can best be spotted from a high vantage point, which isn't always possible for the average beachgoer. So the best way to stay out of trouble is to stick to patrolled beaches and stay between the flags where people can see you. If all else fails and you find yourself caught in a rip, your first priority should be to stay calm and afloat.
Now, that sounds easy to do when you're in trouble and you're drifting offshore. But if you're floating, you're conserving your energy, you have the opportunity to signal for help. And often people don't signal for help. And if you're on patrol beach, you know, there's probably a good chance there's surfers around. And unfortunately, one of those drownings, it was a surfer who made the bystander rescue, but was unable to, at least when the father came in, he was unresponsive. So it's really about floating and signaling for help.
Victorian Premier Daniel Andrews has called on the federal government to make healthcare reform a top priority this year. There are ongoing concerns the declining availability of bulk bill general practice services is putting pressure on hospitals. Meanwhile, workers in the hospital sector have been calling on state governments for improved pay and conditions. Dr. Stephen Duckett is a health economist with the University of Melbourne and joins us now. Welcome to the program.
Thanks, Dan.
What's your assessment of the health system as we launch into this new year?
So, pre-COVID, the health system, the hospitals, the primary care system was under stress. COVID made it even worse. And COVID is not over. People are still getting infected. People are still going to hospitals. Hospital staff are taking time off because they're sick and so on. So the health system now is under greater stress than I think I've seen it in my entire career.
And so what do you make of these renewed calls that we've seen in the last couple of days from the premiers of both Victoria, where you are, and New South Wales, saying that reform to Medicare with a particular focus on bulk billing needs to be the priority for this year?
Obviously, primary care is under enormous stress. Rates of bulk billing are starting to decline. They hit a peak of about 88% at the start of last year. They're down to about 85-ish, 84-ish now. So it's really, people are finding it harder to get a bulk billing GP. We need to actually address the primary care system, which is not just about doctors and primary care, but it's also about multidisciplinary teams to make sure that people with chronic illness can get the care that they need. We're using doctors for what only doctors can do. But it's not only primary care. If you look at hospital emergency departments, they're in deep trouble as well. And the primary care system, fixing up primary care will help, but it won't entirely fix the problem. It's a much wider problem. The states and the Commonwealth both have to step up and try and do things better in 2023 than at the end of 2022.
Dr. Duckett, I want to come back to what that stepping up from all levels of government could and would look like. But first, on that point that you just made, that the rates of bulk billing are continuing to decline, why is that?
I think there's a couple of things. First of all, there was a long freeze in rebates over the period of the Liberal government, which has been, the freeze has been lifted now. But that meant that the rebates were not going up in line with average weekly earnings. They were going up in line with the Consumer Price Index, but obviously a general practice has to employ nurses and so on. And so they were falling behind the sort of cost structures of general practice. Now, how you deal with that is very complex, because the last time rebates went up a lot, doctors worked less hours. And so you didn't get the return as that what you thought you were going to get. So the design of what you need to do is quite complex. It's not a simple problem. It's not a simple fix.
So this doesn't simply come down to increase that rate of bulk billing and you solve the problem. There are multiple levers, it sounds like you're saying, need to be worked in at the same time.
Absolutely. As I said, you've got multiple problems happening at the same time. You've got the shift of the epidemiology in the population to more complex illnesses, more chronic illnesses, multiple chronic illnesses. You've got the financial pressures, and you can't actually fix one without the other. And so it is a complex issue. It's not going to be fixed in one quick decision, and it's not going to be fixed by budget night, for example.
And you mentioned a moment ago that there needs to be work done by state and territories as well as the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth clearly has the impact on Medicare and on some of those levers for bulk billing. What should the state and territories be doing?
Well, I think there's again, it's not a simple problem. You've had underinvestment in the hospital system for a very long period of time. You've often got poor management, which is alienating the staff. They don't feel valued. And the staff are taking sick leave because they've got COVID. The staff feel resentful that the governments are not treating seriously the issue of COVID. So there's a whole complex of problems that states who stepped up really, really well during 2020 and 21, the pre-vaccination period of COVID, and yet they've dropped the ball now, and infections and hospitalisations going up. So it's a complex set of things that have to be done, and the states obviously want to deflect the attention, say it's all the Commonwealth's problem, when it's not. It's shared, and they need to be looking after the things that they're responsible for themselves.
And just to round us out, Dr. Duckett, on that point you made about the COVID pandemic not being over, we've been hearing the news coming out of China and around the world in recent days. What's your assessment of our preparedness around COVID and a seeming reluctance to go back to any of the measures, be that from wearing masks right through?
Yeah. So, COVID is still with us, and we've got to be saying we've got to be actually doing things, partly doing things ourselves, but partly government has to say, look, in really crowded situations like on public transport, masks have to be worn, and start to actually say we are serious about recognising COVID is still with us, and we're serious about doing things to prevent the spread.
Dr. Stephen Duckett, we'll have to leave it there. Thanks so very much for your time today.
Thanks, Dan.
The La Nina weather event that's brought above average rain and flooding has been progressively weakening along Australia's east coast. But there are now concerns of a potential El Nino event for the end of next year, which could bring drought and heightened bushfire risk. Professor Janet Lindsay is a climatologist with the ANU and joins me now from Canberra. Welcome.
Hello.
We've just been hearing news today at the very start of this bulletin about the weather conditions in the far north of Western Australia. How do you read the weather conditions that we're facing right at this moment?
Well, at the moment, as you mentioned in your intro, we're in the final stages of the current La Nina event, and it is on its way out. It's weakening quite rapidly now, and by April, May, it will be over. These events are always over around April or May, so although we've had 3 in a row, each one of them has died off around April, and then in the last couple of years, it's come back again. Now, the current outlook for the rest of this year is that there is a potential for an El Nino event to develop once we get to about June of 2023.
And run us through what the conditions will be and what sort of impact that will have.
Well, if we do get an El Nino event coming up after this La Nina, and there's no guarantee of that, okay, so it's about a sort of 65% chance at the minute that we're looking at an El Nino event. The conditions could go back to neutral. That's another thing which a lot of people don't realise, that conditions in the Pacific don't have to be El Nino or La Nina, they can just be neutral, nothing going on. But if we do get El Nino, then we're looking at warmer than average sea surface temperatures over towards the central and eastern Pacific, towards South America, and cooler than normal waters around the north and east coast of Australia. That in turn means that there's less evaporation off the ocean around Australia, and that means that there's less moisture feeding into our rainfall producing weather systems. Those weather systems can be disrupted a bit as well, and that means less rain over eastern Australia at least, and northern Australia during an El Nino event. And that's something that we've become very familiar with over the decades.
Oh, Professor, you mentioned there that there's about a 65% chance of that El Nino effect. You've been looking at the data very closely. What's your assessment? What do you think is going to happen?
Well, I actually think there is a very tiny chance, and it's only very, very small, I couldn't put a percentage on it, but it's minute, that we could get another La Nina. We have no record of 4 La Ninas in a row. There are records in the past of 3, but our records only go back to 1876 with direct measurements in places where we could tell what's going on. So that's, although it seems like a long time ago, it's not actually really long in terms of how the climate system works. So it would be highly unusual, in fact it would be unprecedented as far as we know, to have 4 La Ninas in a row, but I think we shouldn't completely discount it. I think neutral is a possibility, but again I think that possibility is less than the possibility of an El Nino, sorry. So why do I think that? It's because What the El Nino and La Nina events do for the Pacific Ocean and atmosphere is they allow a sort of release valve for excess heat that builds up in the ocean atmosphere system. And with a La Nina, and we've now had 3 in a row, a large part of the Pacific is cooler than average, and then just over towards Australia it's warmer. With an El Nino, you get a large part of the tropical Pacific being warmer than usual, and that's your release valve for getting rid of some of that extra heat between the ocean and the atmosphere. And I think we're now sort of really primed to have that release valve let off, so that heat can be sort of recycled through the ocean atmosphere system. So my gut feel would be the possibility of an El Nino. But we also have to remember that El Nino isn't just a one-size-fits-all. It can be weak, moderate, or strong. And then the impact of a weak, moderate, or strong El Nino can vary on Australia. So as an example of that, 1997-98, there was a really strong El Nino event. We expected severe drought in Australia. It didn't happen. We had above average rainfall across eastern Australia. 2002, 2003, moderate El Nino event in the Pacific, didn't look as if it would really do very much. Severe drought in eastern Australia. So those are sort of exceptional years. More often than not, it's closer to what you would expect. But what I'm trying to explain is that really there's a whole lot of variables in here. It's not only El Nino and La Nina, it's also what happens in the Indian Ocean and in the Southern Ocean around Australia that can also have an impact. If we do get El Nino, though, bigger chances of below average rainfall and drought.
Well, I think you've done a very good job of explaining all the different variances there. Professor, I guess that makes some of the incredible challenge, doesn't it, of giving advice around preparation and what to do with so many variants. When do you expect to have a more settled view of what will be happening towards the end of this year and into 2024?
Well, we expect to know by June of this year what's likely to develop in the Pacific. There have been some historical instances of an apparent beginning of an El Nino event that then sort of collapsed and didn't come to anything, but that's very rare. And so by about June, we should be pretty certain whether we're getting El Nino or not. And that then gives us the months through winter and into spring in Australia and even early summer to be managing the consequences if it is indeed an El Nino event. And some of those consequences could include the below average rainfall, and that goes together with above average temperatures. And when you've got that combination, drier conditions, higher temperatures in spring and summer, then we're looking at potential really quite serious bushfire risk. And of course, we're coming out of a period where we've had 3 years of above average rainfall. There's a lot of fuel out there, and it doesn't take very long with no rain and high temperatures for that fuel load to dry out. And once it's cured, it just takes a spark to start a fire. And that's something that I think we're going to have to be extremely mindful of as we go through this year.
Yeah, very big challenges. I reckon we'll be booking you in to talk again in the middle of the year. Professor Janet Lindsay, climatologist at the ANU, many thanks for your time.
It's an absolute pleasure, Dan.
The issue of when people living with dementia should stop driving can be fraught with emotion for families and their doctors. Now, Australian researchers are developing a video-based driver safety test to improve the process.
71-year-old John Quinn was diagnosed with younger onset dementia 12 years ago. Safety issues with his driving were one of the clues that something was wrong.
In John's case, the driving and the communication were the big concerns in the beginning.
At first, he continued behind the wheel before deciding to hand over the keys.
I started to have enough insight to realise that things were becoming a little bit more difficult.
His partner thinks he should have relinquished his licence sooner, but she also knows other people who were forced to give up driving while they were still safe.
So in one day they lost their career, their ability to pay their mortgage.
What we need is to put mechanisms in place so that the transition from being able to drive to not being able to drive is done in a respectful way.
Researchers are doing just that. developing a video-based driver safety test for use by GPs.
What the test will aim to do is to test that person's ability to predict a traffic incident.
Individuals will have to identify hazards.
Guy coming out of the survey, look, on a unbroken line.
In Queensland, anyone with a medical condition likely to affect driver safety has to inform the Transport Department and be assessed by a health practitioner. This new tool will help make that assessment clearer.
A test that people living with dementia will accept as a fair test.
The new tests should be available nationally by 2025. Emma Pollard, ABC News, Brisbane.
One of Australia's largest regional festivals is back, with tens of thousands of Elvis Presley fans expected to descend on the town of Parkes in the New South Wales Central West. The Parkes Elvis Festival is a welcome distraction for a community still recovering from recent flooding.
The Parkes Elvis Festival is back for its 30th year here in the New South Wales Central West, with one of the largest crowds expected, with record sales already being seen. They're expecting up to around 30,000 people to attend the festival, which lasts around 5 days. Now, this is crucial for the Central West region, which has been smashed by those record floods in November last year. This festival, it generates around $15 million annually for the town and some of the surrounding areas like Forbes and New Gowra, which were hit so heavily by those floods. Now, this festival, which celebrates the king of rock and roll, it brings people in from across the country and across the world, with people coming from Memphis, the home of Elvis, all the way here to Parkes. Now, we spoke with some people who have travelled up from Adelaide. They've done the 12-hour trip just to get here, and will be spending the entire time here. And that's the kind of commitment that we see from people who really want to celebrate the memory of Elvis Presley.
He's the biggest and the most influential entertainer of our time. And I've been an ETA now for about 20 years. I've been coming here for the last, since 2014. I left my home in Norfolk, Virginia, California, on my mind.
Time for sport now. Catherine Murphy joins me. Catherine, let's start with cricket, and there's been a dramatic start to the third and final test between Australia and South Africa.
Dan, I will request more notice if there is a music package before my sport. I am desperately searching for an Elvis song that might suit a dramatic start to the third and final test. As you said, I'll give you the top headlines and hopefully my brain will retrieve something while talking about cricket. Now, the major headline, David Warner, he's been dismissed for 10 runs. You'd think that was the biggest topic so far on day one, but it's not. Matt Renshaw, he's actually going to play with COVID now. He was brought into the team to replace Cameron Green in the middle order. Josh Hazlewood and Ashton Agar were also recalled, but he had a positive rat test this morning, and that means he will play, but he's keeping his distance from his teammates. You won't see any hugging at any point from Matt Renshaw. He stood separately to them in the anthem, but as I said, we're just watching David Warner dismissed for 10 runs, and those with suspicious minds might think, you know, is this really happening? Yes, it is. It's the case. Matt Renshaw with a late rat test. Hope he's feeling okay. He's playing on anyway. And that was, I think, a poor song selection by me. I think I'll leave the Elvis quotes from there.
Well, they might be spinning on their blue suede shoes to defend the wicket. Now, that's not the only drama playing out, with a controversial man-cat dominating the headlines in the Big Bash League.
Yes, apparently there was an actual match that was played out last night, the Melbourne Derby between the Stars and the Renegades, and there was a really impressive performance from a man who had a 5-wicket haul last night. Not bad at all, but as I said, that was not getting any of the headlines. So Tom Rogers, he had a 5-wicket haul, and the Renegades fast bowler, in fact, he took 5 for 16 as his side produced a 33-run win over the Stars at the MCG. But as you say, all the controversy was about that man-cat, because his match-winning display came after he'd been the target of that rare run-out attempt by Stars skipper Adam Zampa while he was batting at the non-striker's end. Now, Rogers wasn't given out because Zampa's arm had gone too far in its bowling action. However, he was clearly incensed by his rival's act. What did Adam Zampa have to say after his failed mancad? Have a listen.
I mean, if it was a 10th over and I was bowling to two batsmen and it was seriously going to change the outcome of the game, I would probably consider not doing it, probably a warning. But as I said, yeah, with this scenario of the game, it didn't really matter too much. If Tom Rogers had got on strike or Kane Richardson, then like it's not going to change the game too much. Yeah.
Okay, not going to change the game too much. Yeah. Next episode, stunning silence there from the panellists. I'm not sure they were that impressed there, Dan. I'm not a body language expert, but I think I got that one right.
I reckon we cut away just before the raised eyebrows there. In tennis, though, Catherine, Andy Murray and his metal hip are out of the Adelaide International.
And thank you for addressing Andy Murray and his metal hip separately. It's very important that you do that, Dan, because not every tennis player has a metal hip. I'm sure you know. Just check this out. He's lost to Seb Cordes 7-6, 6-3. But look at this rally. What is he putting his metal hip through? This is just so wrong. The run up to the net. He's back at the baseline. Look at the body language as he searches for his towel. Even he knows he has done wrong by his metal hip there. His mum, Judy Murray, the legend, is in the background there with the grey top and the sneakers. Even she knows he shouldn't be doing that with a metal hip. But out of the Adelaide International, 7-6, 6-3 to Seb Corda, the American, that's not a bad loss at all. Characteristic of Murray to take that first set to a tiebreaker. Here is hoping, Dan, that his metal hip and Andy are okay for the Australian Open, because it's so good having him back in Australia after he was kind of retired a few years ago and went off to have surgery. Last year he made the second round at the Australian Open. He's 35 years of age. He's acknowledged that he never knows when will be his last year, so he's hoping to make the most of his time down under.
Yeah, more metal hip chat than I was expecting. Catherine Murphy, thank you.
Thank you.
Time for a look at the weather. Here's Emma Rebelato.
On the satellite picture, ex-tropical cyclone Ellie is still a major focus over the WA Kimberley. That's prompting a severe weather warning. While a heat trough is extending southward from there to near Perth, there's another trough over the southeast, and that's causing a few showers and storms for inland NT, Queensland and eastern New South Wales. But that intense rainfall is continuing in WA, where communities there are facing a 1 in 100 year flood event, while in the NT, more heavy falls are expected over the coming days, and there'll be a few showers in the east as well. Looking to tomorrow's forecast, Brisbane, you can expect showers and a possible storm with 32. Showers for Sydney with 23 degrees. Canberra, a partly cloudy day with 21. Melbourne, partly cloudy, 23. Hobart is looking at a top of 18 degrees. Cloud clearing in Adelaide with 26. Perth, sunny and warm, 38 degrees. And for Darwin, showers with a top of 31.
Now that's the ABC News for now, and a reminder, you can keep up to date on all the latest news across all your devices at news.abc.net.au and on ABC iView. I'm Dan Borsche. Great to have you along. Thanks for your company.